Good morning, good morning. Welcome to another edition of Beyond the Well. We are coming to you live from Hopewell Church in Jacksonville, Florida. I am Naomi.
My name is David, and as you all already know, Beyond the Well is a social media platform. So we have videos. If you hear anything today that you would like to revisit or you've heard in the past, check us out on YouTube, Facebook, like the page.
So you probably noticed David and I are matching this morning. We didn't really do it on purpose, but I think Beyond the Well should start matching like the choir does.
What do y'all think?
But we have another great topic today. Our topic for this morning is suffering. Why does God allow bad things to happen to good people?
That's right. And as I was researching this topic, I looked at a sermon by J. Oswald Sanders. He's an old pastor. Nobody probably knows him. But he describes spiritual leadership in this one particular sermon. And he sums up the sermon with 3 words: sovereignty, servanthood, and suffering. And he defines suffering as the tool with which God uses he employs in the life of the Christian to make him or her a leader. And this particular story, J. Alexander is just finished preaching a sermon at this new church. It's one of his first sermons. He's a new guy. He steps off stage and goes in the back room, and the church is so small he can't help but hear other people talking about him. So there are 2 ladies. They're talking about the pastor. He's like, "Hey, what do you think about the pastor?" And the other lady turns to the other lady and says, "I don't know. He's pretty good, but he'll be much better once he has suffered." Which was really interesting to me. It's like, what is suffering, and how do we as Christians compartmentalize the suffering we experience, and what about non-Christians as well?
Yeah, that's a unique way to think about suffering as a tool to make us into leaders. I think this is an important topic for us to ask because, you know, it can be one of those questions that really divides people, either for God or against God, when they're going through pain, when they're going through suffering. And unfortunately today, you know, there's so much pain and suffering in the world. There's illness, there's abuse, there's broken relationships, there's disappointment. And there are so many people that are asking the question, why would God allow this to happen? But the important thing for us to keep in mind is that, you know, God is eternal. He's omniscient. He's omnipresent. He understands everything. So as human beings, though, we can never expect to fully understand the ways of God. You know, Job is a great example of this. In the book of Job, you know, God had allowed Satan to do anything that he wanted to Job except for killing him. But when we look at how Job reacted to all of the bad things in his life, he said, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him." So Job didn't understand why God was allowing all of these things to occur in his life, but he knew God was good. He knew he was faithful. He knew he had to continue to trust him. And so ultimately that should be our reaction as well.
That's right. So some people, they can't comprehend, they can't fathom that fact that a good God, an omniscient God, and a loving God can cause anyone to suffer. But in the particular story of Job, he had friends around him, right? And Job's friends were under the impression that the only reason why Job would be going through something as drastic as he went through was because of unconfessed sin in his own personal life. And this is a great error that we as Christians can make. So what are Joel's friends doing to Job? They are blaming the person who needs the most consolation and comfort at that time, blaming it on unconfessed sin. So we're bringing guilt on the sufferer at the time that he and she need, I'm going to start that over. This tragic error brings accusations and guilt on the sufferer at the very time he or she needs the most consolation. Well, where else can we go in the Bible where it talks about suffering? Well, we can go to the Corinthians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Paul speaks about suffering. Paul suffers from a gamut of things. He suffers from hunger, thirst, heat and cold, physical attacks. He's dealing with the church there, so he's also dealing with false accusations and betrayals from so-called believers. So Paul is no stranger to suffering, but he knows that God has his back. He understands that suffering is divine. Paul's praise flows from his growing love for God and is just enhanced by the suffering that he's going through. So back to the point that suffering is divine, suffering is both human and divine. Suffering is human because it comes with our humanity, because we are fallen creatures in a fallen world. Suffering is also divine because it comes from God. Suffering ultimately comes from us by the hand of God because God has willed us to suffer. So that goes into what type of suffering are we experiencing? Is it the righteous suffering, or is it suffering that we bring upon ourselves? So the type of suffering that God wills on us is righteous suffering. The suffering which pleases God is that suffering which results from living a righteous life in an unrighteous world. God may use all forms of suffering for his glory and for our good, but the kind of suffering which Christians are recommended or commended is righteous suffering.
Right, and you made the point, so he'll use it for our good. So although suffering doesn't feel good to us, God can use it to accomplish good in our lives. And he does this by fulfilling the promise that he makes to us in Romans 8:28. For we know that in all things, God works for good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. So that's not just a statement, a random statement in the Bible. That's a promise that God makes to us, that although we suffer, although we go through pain, for those of us that love him, who are faithful to him, he'll use it for our good, and that'll be a great testimony to others.
That's right. Well, what about suffering as it relates to other Christians that we interact with, or unbelievers that we interact with? And this is a personal testimony. When I'm suffering, I honestly don't feel like talking to very many people. I don't feel like sticking to the basics, like praying or reading my Bible. Sometimes I feel like, I don't know, going to the top of a mountain, growing a beard, and just laying low for a while. But that's really selfish, if you think about it, because other people need to hear of what we're going through so that they can be encouraged. So our suffering isn't just for ourselves when we're going through it and when we come through, but it's for other people as well. We are here to encourage and uplift one another.
That is a great, great point that we really have to keep in mind. When we're suffering as Christians, we're called to be different. We're set apart. We're this peculiar people. So when we're going through pain and suffering, and other people can look at us and say, wow, David, I know that you're going through something, and yet you're still hopeful. You're still full of joy. You're still praising God. I wonder what it is that he has in him that is causing him to have so much peace. People look at us as Christians and really relate to that. So that's our testimony to others while we're going through suffering, to share that with others so they can see and be encouraged by us.
That's right. It's a cycle. At least that's how I look at it. So this particular sermon by Paul Diffenbaugh, has anybody ever heard of him? I didn't think so. But so he says, and I'm just going to read quote unquote, when we experience Christ's sufferings and share in God's comfort, we are being equipped to minister to others who will experience similar afflictions. If we fail in our sufferings by doubting God and his goodness and questioning his infinite wisdom and mercy, then we shall also fail to experience the comfort that God has for us. Now that goes further. If we fail to experience the comfort that God has for us, we deprive other people of the comfort that they should receive through us.
And another great point to keep in mind, certainly, is that our suffering really will pale in comparison to the glory that we can look forward to in eternity with God. Romans 8:18 says, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. So God, all of the suffering, all of the pain that we're going through now, God is going to make it up to us once we get to spend time with him in eternity, right? So God promises there'll be a time when there's no more crying, there's no more pain, there's no more tears, and we'll be reunited with him in glory. So think about the context of our suffering here. It is for a brief while, and it really pales in comparison to what we'll experience when we get to spend eternity with him.
Well, that's right. Well, what about suffering in the life of the non-believer? Well, it's not the point of 2 Corinthians nor 1 Corinthians. It's often by suffering that God brings other people to him. I know I was going through something when I first accepted Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. It was at a young age, but still, I was going through something. I was in church, and God appealed to me. He appealed to the suffering that I was going through to bring myself to the saving knowledge of his graces. So if there's anybody out there that is saying or questioning Why me? Why am I going through this? The answer is simple. It's because we deserve it. We deserve none of God's blessings, and we deserve the worst punishment we can imagine. But this can be seen all throughout the Bible. All through the Gospels, we see sick and suffering people coming to Christ for healing and deliverance. Many of those sick and suffering people end up accepting Jesus Christ as their personal Lord and Savior. So if you're suffering, your situation, whatever it is right now, has brought you to the point of acknowledging that you are helpless, that your only hope is in God, then you are well on your way.
And so finally, going through suffering, we all have a choice. We can either choose to be bitter and to turn away from God or to turn towards Him. We all have that choice. But what happens if we decide to run to Him? John 16:33 says, I have told you these things so that in me you will have peace. You will have suffering in this world, but be courageous, for I've overcome the world. Allow that suffering, allow that pain to turn you to the peace of God. Have courage, have faith in Him, and know that He has the strength to bring you through. So with that, we are just about out of time.
Yes.
We'll go ahead and prepare everyone for Pastor's sermon. If you'll turn to Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 31. His sermon title is called, I Didn't Love You to Hate You.
And with that, continue to go beyond your church, beyond your community.
And beyond the well.
See you next time.